Welcome back. We've completed our reading of a closer look at Philemon, but I have a few more things that I wanted to include from the appendix. A few thoughts on the writings of the Apostle Paul and Peter concerning the Christian and the institution of slavery. So if you'll give me just a few more minutes to hash out a little bit of what the early Christians in the Roman Empire were dealing with as it came to slavery, I would appreciate it. Slavery has the unique distinction of being neither a new thing nor an ordinary thing, as it has existed as long as recorded history, but remains so off-putting that it could never be seen as mundane. In the modern era, at least in the civilized world, slavery exists mainly in the areas of human trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, and for all intents and purposes is illegal and considered by most to be repugnant. However, Paul did not return Onesimus to his master as merely a matter of law. Paul, and Peter, as we'll see later, lived in a society in which slavery was not a new thing, but was certainly an ordinary thing. Both Jews and Romans held slavery as a normal part of life and had laws to govern its legal practice. Both Paul and Peter speak to the place of the Christian slave and the Christian slave owner living within that paradigm. We might point out in advance that Paul and Peter were both sending mail to the same general location, that would be Asia Minor. It makes me wonder if that particular geographic location had not produced a greater number of Christians who either owned or were owned in the institution of slavery. I've heard it said that slaves outnumbered free men in the Roman Empire by as much as 2-to-1 in the metropolitan areas, such as the capital city. As a result of the empire's many victories in war and the human chattel, which were often taken as spoils. To be perfectly honest, 3 of the New Testament documents that mention slavery were sent by Paul on the same occasion, and at least 2 of the 3 were meant to be read by all 3 parties. That would be the letter to Ephesus, which may or may not be the letter to Laodicea, and the letter to Colossians, and the letter to Philemon that we've been reading. I want to read to you from Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. This is a message that Paul gave to that group on the same occasion that he sent the letter to Philemon. Servants, be obedient to those who according to the flesh are your masters, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart as to Christ, not in the way of service only when eyes are on you, as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, he will receive the same good again from the Lord, whether he is bound or free. You masters, do the same things to them, and give up threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. I've often said I did so well in Greek class they let me take it again. However, one of the words I readily remember is doulos. In both the NIV and the New Revised Standard Version, the word is translated slave as opposed to servant. The latter seems to me to be an attempt to soften the subject. A servant is one who might have a voice in changing the circumstances of his or her employment. A slave, on the other hand, is one who is owned and has little or no say whatsoever in their situation. To refuse the wishes of the master was to risk punishment, sometimes very severe punishment. With that in mind, Paul calls for slaves to be obedient to those who are their masters according to the flesh. Even though they have been made free in the spiritual realm, or more specifically, they've been made slaves of Christ in the spiritual realm, they remain the physical property of another human. Since there was little chance of change, the apostle calls for the best possible Christian example in the situation. He insists that the reason for compliance is not that the practice is morally defensible, but that a Christian is not enslaved to his or her situation, but rather has the freedom to go above and beyond what might be expected as a sign of faith and obedience to the Lord. Oddly, at least to the modern mind, Paul does not call Christian masters to simply free all of their slaves. Instead, he offers a sort of equilibrium between owner and owned. Do the same things to them is a reminder that they also have the opportunity to rise above the normal master-slave relationship and show an example of Christ-like living. As the slave works with the Lord in mind, so should the master, as he remembers that he too must answer to a higher power. While freeing the slaves seems the obvious choice to our generation, Paul did not live in modern America. Perhaps some of the owners who followed Christ and read Paul's letter made that costly choice. If so, it's sure that their neighbors and fellow masters took note. But if nothing was accomplished more than changing the way each treated the other, the ever-strengthened work ethic on the part of the Christian slave and the ever-present grace shown by the believing owner was sure to make a long-lasting impression on both the brethren and the surrounding community. Here's another passage from one of the letters sent on this occasion. This is from Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 22. Colossae was the place where Philemon lived and where Onesimus had escaped. Servants, obey in all things those who are your masters according to the flesh, not just when they are looking as men-pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will receive again for the wrong that he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, give to your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. As mentioned before, Colossae and Ephesus, or Laodicea for that matter, were all quite close geographically. And this passage was written and delivered at about the same time as the previous passage. We won't add a great deal here, but want to notice the challenge Paul gives the slave owners at Colossae, which would have included Philemon. Give them what is just and equal. The New International Version says, give them what is right and fair. Perhaps these directives were slightly more specific than his plea to remember that they also have a master. The Apostle Peter, though he does not offer directives for the owners, has similar things to say to Christian slaves, and for similar reasons. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 21, he says, servants, be in subjection to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the wicked. For it is commendable if someone endures pain, suffering unjustly because of conscience toward God. But what glory is it if when you sin, you patiently endure beating? But if when you do well, you patiently endure suffering, this is commendable with God. For you were called to this, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. One of the ongoing themes in Peter's first general epistle is the hope that by living a life of respectful service, a Christian might influence those around them, particularly if they were in difficult situations. The goal was not to be countercultural, but hyper-cultural, by being the greatest example of a citizen, a slave, a wife, or a husband. One might gain the respect of unbelievers and, given the greatest outcome, might even win them to Christ. At the very least, the Christian could take pride in following the example of Jesus, who is the suffering servant. I'm afraid sometimes I might sound like those old people with whom I grew up. But Peter and Paul were writing to a generation that was used to being in subjection to someone. Unfortunately, we've succeeded in raising a generation to whom this idea is very foreign. They've been told that allowing someone else authority in their lives is one of the worst things that could happen, and they reject it out of hand, except when they see how they might eventually gain the advantage by yielding for a short period of time. Finally, in a passage dealing with the idea of slaves seeking freedom, Paul says the following: "Let each man stay in that calling in which he was called. Were you called being a bondservant? Don't let that bother you. But if you get an opportunity to become free, use it. For he who was called is the Lord, being a bondservant is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who was called being free is Christ's bondservant." Perhaps this passage contains the most clear message for Philemon, Onesimus, and Paul. As a slave, and again the same word doulos is used in this passage, Onesimus should continue to serve his master with fidelity and do his best to imitate Christ in whatever situation. However, should Philemon decide to offer him physical freedom in response to Paul's letter, Onesimus would have no reason to refuse. So in closing, while we celebrate the advances modern society has made in fighting the detestable practice of enslaving other humans, we can still gain great insight from the pens of Peter and Paul. Some things in life are unfair, unjust, wrong. But even in those situations, we can be shining examples of our Savior. Thank you so much for listening along. If you have not yet gone to the YouTube site and signed up as a subscriber, or if you have not put down any likes, or if you have never shared one of our little books, we would love for you to take advantage of the opportunity to do just that. Let us know if you need us. Talk to you later.